Hey, Mompreneur. I know that selling your offers on Instagram is really hard. First, you gotta know how to word your content to make sure that it clearly shows how amazeballs your offer is. And then you also have to know how to craft the content to make sure it appeases the algorithm gods so it actually gets seen by the people most likely to buy it. And on top of all of that, you still have the rest of your business to run, plus the whole motherhood thing. My goal is to help moms help their families through their online businesses. That is why I made Carousels That Sell. Carousels That Sell is a collection of 7 Instagram carousels and captions that have made me over $20,000. So I turned them into plug and play templates so that you can get the same results. Carousels That Sell is super easy to use. It comes with a questionnaire to help you figure out what terms you should be putting into the templates. It makes it so you can easily create and schedule the content, and will help sell your offers for you while you're off playing with your kids. Grab the templates that have made me over $20K for only $27 at socialyours.biz/carousels-that-sell so you can grow your business bank account faster than your kid outgrows their clothes. Welcome back to Mompreneur Mastery. This is episode 31, and I am super excited for you to listen to it because I get to share a really incredible and really insightful conversation that I had with podcast strategist Caroline Hull. Caroline is a podcasting strategist, manager, and CEO of Wild Home Podcasting, which is a boutique podcast management agency. She's also a homeschool mom, just like me. So she helps online business owners create strategic podcasts to help grow their businesses. She discovered her intense love for podcasts after launching her own podcast, and in the process, discovering what powerful tool for growth a podcast can be. There are a lot of parallels between podcast strategy and Instagram strategy, but the execution is very, very different. So it was really interesting to discuss all of these things about making sure your content is strategic, making sure your content is successful and actually helping your business. And I am so excited to share it with you. Caroline believes that everyone has a unique perspective and story worth sharing. She has a passion for helping online business owners share their stories and generate leads through their podcasts. I cannot wait to hear what you think about this episode with Caroline Hull. Welcome to the Mompreneur Mastery podcast, where we share actionable Instagram strategies that fit into a busy mom's schedule so that you can get more engagement, more leads, and more sales in less time so you can spend more quality time with your family. I'm Sydney O'Brien, an Instagram strategist who started my business with 3 kids under 5 and found a way to do it without sacrificing quality time with my family and only working 2 to 3 hours a day. I love helping other mom business owners find that seemingly impossible mom work-life balance instead of spending too much time creating content that isn't getting them the results they want. If you're an overwhelmed but very ambitious business owner and you want to strategize the heck out of your Instagram account so that you can save time and make more sales, you're in the right place. Hi, Caroline. How are you today?
I'm so great. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk about podcast strategy. I consume your content, your podcast, your Instagram stuff. And of course, I'm a member in your membership. And so much aligns with Instagram strategy. The parallels are there, but the execution is very different. So I'm really excited to talk about it to differentiate the execution pieces.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's so interesting because I've been having a lot of conversations with business owners and content strategists, and the strategy really is very similar across the board. Like when we talk about Instagram, YouTube, all the places really where you're creating content. But there are some major differences with podcasting that kind of sets it apart. So I always love digging into this because it's so fun.
Yeah. So to start, what got you into podcasting?
Yeah, so I was actually a stationery designer. This is about like 8 or 9 years ago. I had wedding stationery line, I had greeting cards. And one thing that I loved was having conversations about the business aspect of it. I really loved talking about business and strategy and all the things. And I was literally in a Facebook group there was an app. This is gonna age me. There was an app back then called Periscope, which actually doesn't exist. And so if any of your listeners know what Periscope is, if you'll just DM me on Instagram and we can, like, chat about it, because I feel like nobody remembers what it was. But I had started using Periscope to, like, talk about business, and I really loved it, and I was like, "Oh, it'd be interesting to start a podcast." Literally posted in a Facebook group that I wanted to start a podcast. And somebody in the group was like, "Oh, I wanna start a podcast." And I was like, "Oh, we should do it together," kind of as a joke. And then we ended up launching a podcast called The Creative Biz Rebellion, and it was very successful. We had a very successful community. We had products and courses associated with it and absolutely loved it. It was such a great experience. Well, through that, what became known to me was that I was really good at the back end of podcasting, the technical stuff, the editing, the putting it together. My co-host was super amazing at the branding and the artwork and the marketing, but I was better at that, and I started helping out a couple business owner friends who had podcasts, and then it just snowballed from there.
That's so cool. That's like kind of similar with my start, just the starting with business owner friends and then snowballing into like its own thing.
Yeah, like, hey, you have a business, like, one morning you wake up, you're like, "Oh, this is a whole business by itself." Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So when you say podcast strategy, what does that mean?
Yeah, to me, podcast strategy really boils down to how is the podcast supporting your business? So,
Mhm.
right away when I jumped into podcasting, and again, I mean, I need to preface this because the podcasting world is very different than it was when I first started. But I noticed right away that business owners were trying to podcast the way that podcasters do, right? Like podcasters who are creating storytelling podcasts or maybe comedy podcasts or even news podcasts. The model is so different. And I immediately noticed there was kind of a gap in how we were using the podcast for business owners and making sure that it was actually supporting their business. And that's really where all of this started and how I kind of got into this idea of having a podcast strategy for your business. And again, it just really is about what is the purpose of the podcast? What is it helping your business achieve? And then how can we create a strategy for not only the content that we're creating, but the call to actions that we're putting out there, the funnel we have, you know, in our greater funnel of our business, right? Where does the podcast sit? And then our marketing, and how does that all work together to help us with that purpose? Because, I mean, here's the deal, podcasting is it takes a lot of time to put together a podcast. And I feel like business owners jump into it and they're like, oh, I want to start a podcast. It's going to be so fun. And then they fizzle out because it's hard, it takes time, and you don't necessarily see those returns like you do on Instagram or YouTube, those other places, right? And
Yeah.
where you start to see the success with a podcast is when you have a strategy and you understand exactly what everything is doing to support your business.
Yeah, it's very similar with Instagram, all the things like working together to create that funnel for sure.
Yeah.
And I think the fizzling out part, like I can definitely see that happening because it does take a lot of time. But also, if you don't have a strategy and all of these pieces, all of the episodes aren't working together, it feels a lot like throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks. And that can get really frustrating.
Yeah, and I feel like what happens with a lot of podcasters is because they don't have a great content plan in place, because they don't have a great strategy for how it's supporting their marketing and their launches and their promotions throughout the year, what they'll do is and listen, I've done this too. And when it happens because you know right away, but like they'll create an episode last minute, right? So you'll go, "Oh my gosh, I have an episode that needs to go out on Monday." It's like Thursday, Friday before the weekend. You're like, "Okay, let me just record something real quick." And then what you're putting out there isn't necessarily being put out there with purpose, and it isn't necessarily being put out there, it's not your best content, right? And that's really like when we start to see the negative impacts. And we call it pod fade in the podcasting world. It's when podcasters like release an episode and then they don't release an episode and then slowly they stop podcasting altogether. And, when you have a strategy and a plan in place, it's so much easier to create amazing content consistently. And that's really what's going to help you not only build your audience, but retain your listeners. And so, yeah, strategy and having a plan, it's a huge part of, I think, long-term podcasting success. And because podcasting is a long game, that strategy and that plan is so important.
Hmm. I can definitely see that. And I've definitely had those times where I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't have anything ready to go for Monday. What do I do? And I just do like something very quick that isn't as in line with my entire marketing strategy as it should be, just to be able to put
Right.
something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're just like, "I just gotta get something out, whatever it is." Yeah, totally. I listen, like I
exactly.
said, I've been there, I've done that. We all have. It happens.
For sure. How do you rate the success of your whole podcasting journey?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question because I think it's a really important one, and, we're seeing a lot of shifting in the podcast industry right now as a whole, and so I think this is such an important conversation. So, where a lot of people get tripped up with podcasts, especially and I'm talking about always, specifically business owners. They think that if they create a podcast and get millions of downloads, that will help them grow their business. And it's so hard because with podcasting, we don't have super great metrics like you do with Instagram. Even YouTube has way better metrics than podcasting. In fact, I have been diving into YouTube a little bit, and I took a workshop a couple weeks ago, and the whole time I was sitting there, I was like, "Man, why don't we have this for podcasting?" Because she was talking about like keyword research, and it's so much easier to do in YouTube than it is in podcasting. Now, we do keyword research in podcasting, but it's not as black and white as it is with YouTube. And the whole time I was just sitting there going, I want this. And so, as somebody who is in all these marketing spaces, you're going to very quickly realize like the metrics for podcasting are not as great. The only metric we really have to measure is this thing called downloads or listens. And that's literally like the number of times somebody clicked play and listened a certain amount of time, depending on who's measuring it, right? Like there's so many caveats. And that can
Yeah.
get really frustrating because we're so used to looking at insights, right? We're so used to looking at engagement and how many people pressed play, not necessarily like how or how many times was the play button pressed, not necessarily how many people pressed play. We're so used to seeing these different metrics. And so when you go back into the back end of podcasting, it's like, oh, is this good? I don't know. Is this good? And so, what I always tell my clients and what I really try to drive home to everyone when I'm talking about podcast strategy is how we measure it is really dependent on what your goals are. You know, this is why having a purpose for your podcast is so important when you sit down and you say, "Hey, I'm going to create a podcast for my business." And I always say, what is the ultimate goal here? Is the ultimate goal to get people in your membership? Is the ultimate goal to grow your email list? And then what can we set up to measure that? And how can we track that? And that's really what I want people to do. The other thing too is I think with podcasts, when we're talking about is it a success or not, is we have to really reframe how we think about our podcast. I think, I can compare it to Instagram a little bit. I feel like Instagram, and you can totally correct me if I'm wrong here because I'm not an Instagram strategist, but you post a reel and you get kind of immediate results, right? Like, like pretty much right away if it's going to do well or not, or if it's going to convert, you can tell, pretty quickly. Podcasting is a little different. It's a long game. We do have like measurements that we look at like 7 days, 30 days, 90 days. But what's so amazing about podcasting is that it is this piece of long form content that is nurturing and lives forever. And so a year from now, somebody may find my podcast, listen to 5 episodes, and come book a service with me. And so there are some other kind of like, I call them intangibles of how we measure, like, is this podcast a success or not? A really good example is I had a client recently and she felt like she wasn't getting any conversion with her podcast. So we redid her content strategy. And I talked to her a couple weeks later, and she was already getting people in her membership who said, I came from the podcast. And I
Wow.
think she had something else in there, like booked something else or sold something else. And it wasn't necessarily that she was able to track this, but it was that people told her, Well, I joined because I listened to this episode. And that's another way that you kind of know it's a success. So again,
Yeah,
knowing what the purpose of your podcast is, and then also just having a really good understanding of how it's working for your business.
that makes a lot of sense. And I was actually looking at my downloads and like stats and everything the other day, and I am still getting leads from a lead magnet from that I promoted in one of my very first episodes
Yeah.
that I don't really have it. I don't really market it anymore in any other content or in emails, but it's pretty cool that like months later I'm still getting leads from it.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? And
Mm.
that's one of the things too about podcasting, because they do live forever in a way that's different, I think, from other content. You
Mhm.
always have to make sure those links are updated and redirecting and so I always try to, like, remind myself every once in a while to go back through and look, like, did I redirect that correctly? Or, if I got rid of something because people do, they find your podcast and they'll just listen to your entire library and then click on something from 2 years ago, and you're like, "Oh, okay, thanks." It's so funny.
Yeah, it works out really well. There's definitely a draw to like long form content that does that as opposed to like having to constantly do things more frequently on Instagram.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I love about podcasting. I mean, you and I have talked. I am not good with the gram. Me and Instagram, we're in a very love-hate relationship right now. But I really struggle with the short videos. But down and do an hour, I can talk for an hour about podcast strategy, but if you ask me to make a quick reel about it to post on Instagram, I'm like, I don't know what to do. And I just think that's so funny. And I definitely think, like, people have their strengths. Some people are better at short and long, but I think it works really well for me because it invites people to come and listen to me and really hear, like, my philosophies, what I teach, how I talk, how I show up in a way that I
Mhm.
think is so unique from short form content. And so,
Yeah,
for me, really that sweet spot is when it all works together, when your short form content is leading to your long form content and vice versa, and then leading to your lead magnets. That's when you like hit the sweet spot is when it can all kind of be cohesive and all working in this like well-oiled machine. So I don't think you have to do one or the other. I think both are fantastic and they can work together so well.
for sure. That's the dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
And then you mentioned earlier about listener retention. How can you tell if you are retaining listeners?
Yeah, so what we do to see if we're retaining listeners is look at our downloads week to week. There's
Mhm.
kind of two really good indicators. And to me, this is all about content. So, is my content hitting the mark? I can usually tell if two things are happening. A, my downloads are staying the same each week. So, I don't have like a ton of fluctuation. Or B, they're going up consistently. And that's usually when we can tell that we're retaining listeners, right? Because they're coming back each week, especially that first number you see after you post an episode, that like initial kind of spike that you have, because those are usually
Yeah.
people who have subscribed or followed you in an app, right? Where we get into trouble is when we start to see those downloads go down every week, it seems like we're losing some listeners, right? And that's usually a pretty good indicator. Okay, something's off with my content or maybe my podcast isn't being distributed correctly, but usually it's a content thing. And so,
Mhm.
kind of at that point, I will usually advise, like, okay, well, can we shake it up? What can we do different? Can we talk about something you haven't talked about before? Or look back through your episodes, see which ones did really well before. Can we reiterate those in some way? You know? So that's usually how we tell. Like I said, podcast metrics are not the best. There's not like a place you can go and see like all the things you want to see, which is
Right.
really frustrating. So that's my hope and dream for the podcasting future.
Yeah, that's so nice. Having that data is a game changer and saves a lot of time instead of just like trying and seeing how it goes.
I know it does sometimes feel like a lot of guessing with podcasting, which I think is where people get tripped up. And so,
Mhm.
that's why, like, I think, again, like, it all goes back to strategy. That strategy is really going to help you understand, like, what the metrics are telling you and if they're telling you what you need to know and how that's helping your business. And at the end of the day, like, that's way more important than, like, how many downloads you got. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. And that also coincides a lot with Instagram, like the actual how it relates to your business instead of just vanity metrics is something I have been talking about in my content recently. So yes, I wholeheartedly agree.
I always try to remind my clients that, like, imagine you walked into a room and so let's say, like, you had 50 people listen to an episode. That's literally like, can you imagine walking into a room and there's 50 people sitting there who just want to listen to you talk about the thing that you want to talk about? And so I think sometimes that helps us kind of put it into perspective because we can feel kind of down on ourselves like, oh, I just don't have enough downloads. And I heard somebody say the other day, like, don't devalue the audience you have just because it's not
Right.
what you think you need. And I was like, so good
That is
because,
good.
it really is true. Like, if there's 40 people who are coming and listening to your podcast each week, you're doing something for those 40 people. And so then the question can become, okay, well, how do I increase this number? But don't ever feel like you're doing badly because that's where you're at.
Yeah, I love that so much, not devaluing the audience you have. And it is true. It's hard sometimes when you see just like numbers and bar graphs. It's very easy to forget that those are actual people, like
Yeah.
listening or learning from you. Like,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I feel like in this marketing, like, environment we're in now where everybody's, like, posting online, like, how much money they made and how many crazy download numbers they got, it can be real easy to kind of fall into that trap of, like, "Well, if I just get 1,000 downloads on this episode, I will have made it." Like, what does that even mean? And so, that's why I focus so much more on the purpose than the actual metrics.
yeah, I love that so much. Do you have any advice for mom business owners that want to start a podcast and make sure they're good on the strategy part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think especially for mompreneurs, the key is going to be having a really solid system. And the key to perfecting that solid system for your podcast is having a strategy. So, really planning out your content way in advance, looking at your marketing and sales calendar, putting the two together. What's so great, like I'm a homeschool mom. I don't have a ton of time. And so I have my content planned out for the next month at least, if not 2 months. And what's so great about that is that when I'm having a busy week and I've got to get an episode out, I know that I can sit down, pull up my calendar, look at my schedule, say, oh, this is the episode that I'm supposed to do. Does it still feel aligned? Great. Let me knock out this script in 30 minutes from a template that I created. And let me sit down and record this tomorrow when I know I have a stretch of quiet time. Having something as simple as that system is what is gonna make podcasting feel easier, and then it's gonna make it sustainable for you. So, sit down, plan out your content, and then think about all the things you need to do with your podcast to get it out the door. And what can I make a template of? What can I put in a folder that just I can just open and go? And that's what we do for all of our clients. We create dashboards for them and everything is in there. And people always are like, I don't think a system is the problem. But then when you get them in the system and using the spreadsheet consistently, they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And so I think that would be my biggest piece of advice. If you're thinking about getting more strategic with your podcast or starting a strategic podcast, the best place to start is with having a really consistent plan.
That is great advice. I find that even when I have just like an idea of what I want to talk about in an episode, it also just takes off like a lot of the stress and overwhelm of like, oh my gosh, what do I need to do right now? Because I know at least part of it is done. And I've used the template in Strategic Podcasting Academy for the show notes and everything, and it does save a ton of time. It helps so much.
Yeah, it really does. So I used to not be a real big organizational person. And if anybody knows me, they're going to laugh at this because they know that I thrive in chaos. But I have become so organized in my business and with my podcast. And I love those templates. I have templates for show notes. And then I just released into the academy like a script template for interviews and solo episodes. And I've been using those for my own podcast, and it has been so amazing. I used to riff all of my episodes. I used to never write down bullet points or anything. And my downloads actually started going down. And I realized it was because I was being too repetitive. And also just the quality of content wasn't there. And since I've started actually scripting them out, it has made such an impact. And so, it seems, like I said, it seems silly to sit down and like create templates and things like that, but it really can affect the actual quality of the content that you're putting out. So if you take the time to set it up on the front end and incorporate it into your schedule, it'll make things so much easier.
Yeah. I find if I also don't write it down, I will forget and then I'll go back and be like, oh man, I forgot this like really important point that I wanted to make.
I know. I also keep a bank of episode ideas because I'll be like
Right.
walking around and I'll be like, oh, this would make a great podcast episode. And then I'll sit down later and I'll be like, what was that idea I had?
Yeah.
It was so good.
She's gone. Yeah,
Mom brain.
for sure. Does that ever go away? I feel like I've had it for years.
I don't think so. Not that
Yeah.
I do have a big age gap in my kiddos, so I kind of set myself up for failure there. So
I have like no age gap in between mine, and it's not, I feel like either way, it's just rough.
I always laugh. My husband and I always laugh because we felt like we were kind of getting the hang of things. We have two for the listeners who don't know. I have two olders. She'll be 13 and then 10. And then I have a 3-year-old. And so like we were in the home stretch. Like we were like gonna be free and easy, like, because we were sleeping
Yeah.
in and then we had my 3-year-old. And so we laughed because we're like, what do we do to ourselves? Like we're so tired. When did this happen?
Going through like the diaper stuff and like potty training and all of that all over again. That sounds
Yeah.
like a lot.
Especially when you were like, I'm done with this. And then now you're
Right.
doing it again.
Yeah, I'm like, we're finishing that phase now, and I'm very excited to be like completely over it.
I'm ready to be done with it too. Let me tell you.
Yeah. And you have a resource to share with listeners, right?
Yes, I do. So one of the things that I teach a lot is how to structure your episodes so that they are set up in a way that is promoting selling, because the whole concept of having a podcast for your business, right, is that you're supposed to sell what you do on your podcast. And so I have a resource, it's a guide on how to set your episodes up for sales. Even if you haven't launched a podcast yet, this is a really great guide to look at to kind of give you an idea of, okay, what do I need to put into the structure of my episodes to make sure that I'm promoting what I have going on and I'm, sharing what I'm working on, all of those things. And you can get that at wildhomepodcasting.com/sales.
That sounds amazing. I'm going to link to it in the show notes. And then can you share where you are, like the name of your podcast, where people can find you and where they can find you on Instagram
Yeah,
as well?
absolutely. My podcast is Share, Strategize, and Shine. And I talk all about podcast strategy on my podcast. It's a podcast about podcasting. So if you want to hear more about what podcast strategy can look like, definitely go listen to that. And then to find out more about what I do, you can head to wildhomepodcasting.com. And then I'm at Wild Home Podcasting on Instagram. So that's where you'll find me.
Perfect. And definitely check out that resource and our podcast. I listen to your podcast every week.
Oh,
It's been so incredibly helpful.
I love
Like,
that so much. Thank you. Yeah, as has yours. So thank you.
perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
I hope you found this conversation with Caroline as insightful and valuable as I did. Creating a solid podcast strategy is super essential for mom business owners to make their podcast sustainable and effective, because we do not have time to waste on tactics that are not actually helping our businesses. Like I said, lots of parallels here, even though the execution is very different. I am so glad I have Caroline's expertise from her content on her podcast and her Instagram, and also from her Strategic Podcasting Academy membership. It has made just such a big difference in making sure that my podcast is supporting my business and also in streamlining my processes, which saves me a ton of time, which I'm sure is something all of you can appreciate. Don't forget to grab Caroline's resource guide on structuring your podcast episodes for sales at wildhomepodcasting.com/sales. It is a fantastic tool for honing your podcast strategy, even if you haven't launched yet. You can find more valuable insights and podcasting tips from Caroline on her podcast, Share, Strategize, and Shine, And don't forget to give her a follow on Instagram at Wild Home Podcasting. You can get the links for all of those things in the show notes. And I will catch you in the next episode of Mompreneur Mastery. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for listening. If this content was helpful for you, if you found it valuable, I would love it if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts so that other mom business owners can find this episode and get the same tips and strategies to support their business and their families. If you have questions or just want to connect, you can find me over on Instagram. My handle is @socially.yours.strategist.